Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Matt Kreis, the General Counsel at the Center for Community Progress. Before turning it over to our speaker, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Thank you so much, Julia. I'm going to share my own screen here. Give me just a second. Okay. And I think we're good to go. All right, hopefully everybody can see the screen here. Julia, let me know if at any point in time you can't. Just come on back and let me know. Good afternoon or good morning to some of those of you who are like me in the Central Time Zone. My name is Matt Kreis. As Julia mentioned, I'm going to dive right in here. Just want to give you all a heads up as we talk about heir property and vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties today. And I just want to be sure that folks know that this is sort of an heir property 101. For those of you that have joined some of our previous webinars about heir property 101, I want to be clear. It's not going to be a whole lot of brand new information. I'm going to present a little bit on some of the things that, reasons why we at the Center for Community Progress care about it and how we hope to be better partners along with our partner municipalities and land banks and communities to all of those great folks who are working in this heir property space. Big issues to deal with, and I think it's something that needs a lot more attention that we can all kind of bring together. So. That is a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So first, to start out with, it's just a picture, right? This is the type of property that Center for Community Progress works with all of our local governments, our land banks, our nonprofit, our residents, and community partners to address across the country, right? We all know the physical, the mental, and the financial impacts this property has on neighbors, and that this issue is so much more predominantly felt in lower income communities, in more Black communities, as well as other communities of color, right? We also understand the significant public costs associated with trying to make this property safe, right? To try to untangle the years of public and other public debts associated with it, and to ultimately work to get this back to being an asset for the neighbors and the community, right? That's our focus at Community Progress, and it's important and critical work. But this property and so many other vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties like it across the country, in rural, in suburban, in urban spaces, it also, though, has a history, right? And it's one that we need to understand, both in our efforts to address what it has become and to identify what might be done to prevent it from becoming this way in the first place. Right. So along that line, we're going to be talking about heir property, heir-owned property. And we'll get into what we mean by that in just a second. But for now, just remember that this place, it used to be somebody's house, right? It's its home. It has a story. For our purposes right now, I think some of you have your own stories, your own family issues, but imagining that your grandma used to live there and your mom or your dad or your siblings were raised there. Maybe you played on the porch as a kid, but over time, grandma ended up passing away, right? And your mom and your siblings all kind of assumed they own it, but they'd all moved out and they all meant to take care of it, but it wasn't really anyone's top priority, right? Over time, a lot of the deferred maintenance issues started to pile up, right? The bills got harder to pay, the tax bills especially, and maybe you weren't even getting some of that homeowner exemption that you used to get, right? So one of your aunts may have tried to apply for a grant to make some repairs, but maybe she was denied because she didn't have the right paperwork. maybe a couple of your parents' siblings passed away over the years, and you think your kids might have some interest now, but you aren't sure. Eventually, you kind of stop going there, and it begins to look at some point like this, right? And this is the ultimate thing that is just such a tragedy that, we want to try to avoid, but also when it becomes vacant and abandoned, we also want to try to mitigate the thing. And how do we deal with that balancing act, right? So that's just one story, and there are many other stories that are far more tragic and far more, tougher to deal with, that folks deal with as they, find themselves in this situation as the heirs of an owner who passed away at some point in time. And we had some challenges to try to figure it out. So what do we call heir property, right? It's typically property that has passed to an heir. Either there was a will or some kind of estate plan, but there was further action needed to record or take title to a deed, and that was never done. Or if there is no will or estate plan, or if any of those things happen, right? It's just there's a question on that title to the property as to, who owns it, who has control of it, right? And so that situation where then that gets, title gets fractured amongst multiple heirs in many cases, or eventually, that heir then passes away and passes on to theirs. And so that fracturing continues to happen and makes it really difficult to try to manage that scenario. So I think I'm just going to kind of talk through a couple of the terms that I'm going to use. And again, we use these terms in a certain way. There are a lot of lawyers and a lot of experts in this space that might use things a little bit differently. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to use the term for ownership, right? I think that, when somebody passes away and title passes intestate, right, when there's no will, and passes to those heirs, there's still some form of ownership. There's some sort of right to possess, to use that property. And then title is also another way to kind of say, what's your proof of the legal ownership? And how do you show that proof? And that becomes, most commonly the way you prove your ownership is by you have a deed to the property, a deed that illustrates what your interest in the property is, or some kind of other estate or docs. I'll use the term estate planning. And I mean that as sort of a umbrella term, right? Those are various tasks, which could include making a will, could include setting up a family trust or something else, could mean just the various ways in which you might pass on that property or do something with your assets when you pass away to manage your finances upon passing. A will, I think most of us understand what the will is. That's the most common way to document person's wishes for the property distribution. And then probate. I use the term probate, and I think most folks know that that's a legal process for reviewing and administering the person who passed away's estate, right? For looking at the will, making sure that all the steps are taken to transfer those assets in a responsible way. Okay. So when you have heir property, right, you may have ownership, right, as an heir, but a lot of these other things, there are challenges with. You have challenge proving your title, right? There wasn't an estate plan, there wasn't a will, there wasn't ever a probate thing. And so there's all these things make it really complicated to prove that ownership and to access all of the benefits of home ownership, right? I say here, why clear title? And I want to be very clear too that I use the word clear title here to be as inclusive as possible. And maybe a better phrase would be to why resolve title, because it doesn't always have to look that way. Figuring out what to do to sort of access those benefits of home ownership or access what's best for you and your family may be different than just simply clearing the title completely and having one person on ownership. It may be a agreement between the heirs to continue to jointly hold it. Each person owns 25% or something and whatever. However, if you can start to resolve these issues, you move past that unstable form of ownership, right? Where you're vulnerable to a predatory partition action, where somebody buys one interest and then tries to foreclose on the property. Or you may be more vulnerable to foreclosure, right? If you can prove this title or the ownership, you can start to prove that the property is free from other potential claims. You can hopefully secure title insurance, which is such a clear and important part of securing financing. You can get financing. You may help to be qualified for grants or loans. Maybe if there are grants to help out with some property tax relief or home repair grants. And you can also much more easily sell or transfer the property to a new owner, right? And recognize hopefully a higher price for you and that family. So those are some of the backdrop behind it, right? And when you don't have those things and, you pass away, and I say, here in this chart, we have a thing that says no will with will. You could read no estate plan with estate plan, right? You could read it a couple of different ways, but, with that plan and with the activities that, taking care of those activities followed out in that estate plan, you can get that property passed on to the clear owners and hopefully enjoy all the benefits of the home ownership. Without the will, maybe that there are benefits to that. Again, work with your own lawyers to figure out what those are. But often what you see is that title continue to get fractured. And as generations go on, that title can become further fractured and it becomes harder and harder to resolve some of those issues over time. If you don't have all those things, unfortunately, it makes this kind of an outcome maybe perhaps a bit more likely, right? Which is something that we all, I think, want to avoid seeing. And so that's really, before we move on, just conservative estimates from a lot of folks looking at this have found that there are at least, I think, 500,000 residential heirs properties across the nation. So I would very much emphasize the phrase conservative estimates. In fact, I think estimates looking at property types found about 500,000 heir properties in the South and Appalachia alone, right? So the issue may be widespread, but it absolutely disproportionately affects a certain subset of homeowners and property owners throughout. There's a lot that's been written about certainly Black landowners in the South and Black farmers and how there's been a whole loss of land through all of those. The Center for American Progress estimates that Black landowners lost about 90% of their rural and agricultural wealth between 1910 and 1997, just hundreds of billions of dollars. But we also see these issues in urban contexts, right? In my period of time, I worked formerly with the law department at the city of Chicago. And I worked at one point on a whole lot of issues related to vacant properties, code enforcement issues, quality of life citations. And a lot of the property owners that would go through this process on record were deceased. And we would end up trying to track down the heirs. And there was a whole lot of those scenarios where this fractured ownership model was impacting the family's understanding and ability for how to sort of take care and move that property forward and access the benefits of home ownership. So it's definitely something that crosses a lot of boundaries. And we'd love to be part of that movement that kind of helps to shrink this issue nationally. So one of the things that we have talked about, and I want to be clear here, is we view our job, the Center for Community Progress in this area, primarily bringing attention to this issue and to identify ways that the folks we work with the most, right, local governments, land banks, nonprofits, and other community partners can better understand these challenges and how they might be able to plug into a lot of the excellent work that's being done around the country. There are many, many opportunities to do so. And while we come to this work from that back end, where that property is vacant and we need to find something to remove that negative harm from somebody else, we also want to urge our partners to think more about how far upstream they can go to prevent these properties from sliding down that path in the first place. To that end, we aren't necessarily the experts in figuring out how to resolve each of these individual heir property issues. There are many organizations and private and nonprofit lawyers or lawyers that work for nonprofit firms and legal aid clinics that are equipped for and experts in helping families to resolve these particular issues. There's a lot of these organizations out there. There's the Center for Heir Property Preservation, the Georgia Heirs Property Law Center, all kinds of legal aid organizations that are doing excellent work. I'm going to talk about this. There's a group of private attorneys that do this work, which are also really critically important. And also many of them are connected through an organization called the Heirs Property Preservation Network, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Ultimately, we know a lot of the tools that we can do to resolve some of these issues, right? But all of that stuff, all the legal work and everything else that goes along with it is expensive. It's time consuming, and all of those groups continue to need resources, attention, and support. And so, there's also a lot of great research out there that's been done by a whole lot of other organizations. The Housing and Property Rights Center at Boston College Law, the Initiative on Land, Housing and Property Rights at Boston College Law, academics all over the country, USDA, National Consumer Law Center, right? So a lot of folks, and what we all need to continue to do, and a lot of these folks are working together, is to continue to bring all of those things together to try to make sure those things are connected, and can give everybody an excellent thing. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes too is just illustrate a couple of the examples where we've worked with and have shared some of the examples of local governments and where they've done some really interesting work around this issue, and also some of the key partners and areas for ways local governments and other partners could be plugged into this going forward. And our hope is that you all listen to these examples, can reach out to folks, you can reach out to us, you can reach out to these folks individually, and also think of ways to build on those efforts to bring these things back to your community as well. So how can local governments really help, right? Education, key area, right? We need to continue to bring attention to this. And while it's not always the easiest for a local government to bring some of this information to families that particularly may feel like they've been wronged by the local governments in the past, it's important that local governments, if they can't provide some education around it, they understand who is providing education and can point to other folks. Local governments also have a wealth of data around properties and usually are, in many cases, one of the first entities that can understand where, right, folks a property might become heirs property, right? Code enforcement is one I mentioned earlier. A lot of times that might be the first time a local government is aware that, oh, hey, this property owner passed away, but somebody's still living there. Is that an heir? Again, that's a touch point to gather data, understand the scale of the problem, and maybe point them back to those resources. Homeownership benefits. Do the grants or loans or weatherization programs or home repair products that are out there, can heirs qualify for those, right? Or is there a way to get them to qualify for them? I think local governments can look at whether or not that's something they can do. In some cases, you're going to need to amend state law, right? And so local governments are going to need to understand where state law is a barrier for heirs being able to access some of those resources. Clear title or resolved title, right? That's another important area. Maybe local governments have some tools or some resources to be able to help people either direct them to resources or lawyers who can help them resolve these families resolve those issues. Maybe there are entities like land banks that have the ability to file bulk or expedited quiet title actions and might be able to serve as a resource for folks looking to try to resolve some of these issues. And then lastly, helping families sort of reclaim land that has gone through this public process. This is a much smaller area, maybe these are vacant properties that have gone into this inventory, but the heir, through no fault of their own, sort of got left behind or something like that. And I'm going to talk in a couple of examples about that too. So these are just some of the broad categories that we've been dreaming up with folks around ways that local governments might be able to help. And I think that it's going to be, some of these are hard, some of these are already happening. Some cities and municipalities and land banks and others are doing great work, and some are just beginning to learn about it. In any event, there's more that can be used here, or there's more that can be done here, but these are the 6 sort of key areas that we've been able to identify so far. So here's some examples. First and foremost, right, I think that one of the things you'll hear as far as municipalities getting involved is Philadelphia comes to mind right off the bat. This is this Tangled Title Fund, and it's a really fascinating tool that the city has poured a ton of resources and other partners have poured a ton of resources into. The Tangled Title Fund is funded by the city of Philadelphia, and its eligibility criteria are set by the Division of Housing and Community Development. There's an independent Tangled Title Fund Advisory Committee, which is made up of attorneys from a range of practice settings, including large law firms, solo practices, right? And then there's this separate entity, the Philadelphia VIP, that administers the Tangled Title Fund. They process applications and funding requests to help resolve these things. You know, they're separate entities. They have different eligibility criteria, but you know, all disbursement requests, you know, it kind of depends on the money, but applicants are eligible for up to $4,000 in costs. And I don't know if that's still the same number, if maybe it's gotten higher. Could be an additional cost of up to $5,000 on a case-by-case basis, primarily for those applicants facing particularly, you know, high inheritance tax and transfer tax bills, right? And this is to help them sort of figure out some ideas for how they can resolve the title. It doesn't provide direct help with, I think, legal issues, but again, this is more information you can find on the website. There are great experts looking at this issue in Philadelphia, and I think it's a really great model for folks to learn from. There we go. Here's an example of counties, right, helping to address tax delinquency. You know, there's, you know, one of the things about owning property within this sort of uncertain title status, right, this uncertain heir property status, is it makes it vulnerable to a lot of things. It makes it vulnerable to, you know, an heir selling one of their interests to a developer otherwise acquiring that, and then forcing a sale or a partition of the property, right? That's one way that folks have lost their homes. But we also talked earlier about property taxes. Property taxes are still going to be one of the most significant responsibilities that an heir or a family member might have to be able to try to keep that property within the family. And without access to a lot of resources or property tax relief, maybe without access to the homestead exemption, which, by the way, is another policy area. I don't have it listed on a slide here, but Texas several years ago passed a law that allowed some heirs to qualify for and receive the benefits of homestead type exemption. And so that's worth checking out as well. But property taxes are a real potential source of loss of that family land and wealth, and via property tax foreclosure, right? And so there's a real fascinating program that was put together by the former Washtenaw County Treasurer, Catherine McClary, and Teresa Killeen, who's the digital attorney for the probate court judge in Washtenaw County, Michigan. And, you know, Catherine has passed, but created this legacy of this program of really working as the county treasurer to identify heirs, right? Family members who were at risk of losing their property and entered tax delinquency. And what she had done is work closely with the probate judge to set up sort of a pipeline to sort of refer these individuals. She would put some kind of a stay on sort of moving forward with the tax foreclosure process and refer these individuals to the probate judge, who had worked hard to build a network of some pro bono lawyers and attorneys that could help serve some of these families and just try to resolve some of those title issues that would allow these families then to qualify for some of the tax relief or payment plan options that are available out there and hopefully avoid delinquency. And I can say that at least as of about a year and a half ago, 25 or more families had already been helped and saved from foreclosure by this system. And I think there are a number more in the pipeline that the current Washtenaw County Treasurer is absolutely committed to continuing to serve. And there are a lot of counties in Michigan that are looking to replicate this program and have started to and are doing so in a number of different ways. And so that's a really good example of where the county, specifically the county treasurer, has looked to try to avoid this issue of that property going down that path line and eventually becoming vacant, and hopefully allowing the heirs to figure that out. Land banks are also playing a really important role as they realize, right, that their inventory, you know, and land banks, again, as a reminder, are, you know, most often quasi-governmental entities, usually created pursuant to state statute. And their job is to sort of acquire and manage and dispose of a lot of vacant and abandoned properties so that those properties can stop being such a harm going forward and can you know, be put back to productive use in line with a lot of what the community wants. But what a lot of these land banks also realize is that a lot of their inventory, which usually comes from the tax foreclosure pipeline, are properties that the owner passed away and may have left it to the heirs, but the heirs didn't either get the notice or have the knowledge to be able to prevent that property from going down that path. And so there's a couple of land banks that I'll highlight here, the Calhoun County Land Bank Authority and the Chatham-Savannah Land Bank Authority in Georgia, which have recognized that that's what their inventory is and have looked to create new policies and programs to be able to try to reconnect some of, and it's limited, but some of those heirs with the family land that may have passed into that inventory. Right, and the Calhoun County Land Bank Authority in Michigan has worked very closely with the Washington Heights neighborhood and created the Washington Heights Neighborhood Advisory Committee. Washington Heights being a neighborhood in Battle Creek, Michigan, predominantly Black community, been experienced a lot of disinvestment over the years, and a lot of the land bank's inventory ended up being in Washington Heights. They worked really closely with Washington Heights over a period of some time to say, can we change our policies to allow family members of property that has heirs property that's located in this neighborhood to apply for those properties, right? To try to, how can we give those families some preference in certain circumstances when they can have a plan for the property? And it doesn't have to be a major one, but it's just to try to get that property back into that family, that family's ownership. And so they've looked at creating and have changed their policies around this and are working on trying to make that work locally. Interestingly, Calhoun County is also working very closely with, the land bank is also working very closely with the county treasurer and others to try to implement something like that Homes for Generation type program, as well as another way of hoping to prevent those properties from going down that path to begin with. Chatham-Savannah Land Bank Authority, I don't have time to go so deep into everything that they have done as well. Allison Goldie is the director there. They've just done some excellent work in partnership with the city of Savannah, Georgia, and partnership with the local Affordable Housing Trust Fund and other folks. And what they've done is they've created a program where they've, again, tried to find the heirs of some of these properties that are maybe not necessarily in the land bank, but also maybe not necessarily in the land bank, but also multiple years of tax delinquent in a state of disrepair where the only, the public liens or the debts are usually exceeding the value of the property. And so what they've done is identified a number of properties where the city can come in with special powers and the ability to sort of acquire that property, and the land bank can then work with the heir to try to figure out, the heir that's coming back to them and saying, hey, that's my family land, I don't know how to save it. Is there anything we can do to try to figure out how to clear up all these issues, clear up the title, and is there a way we can get a hold of it? And so the land bank has successfully worked with at least one and a couple, I think there's more in the pipeline as well, where they've been able to pull in those owners, pool a bunch of resources from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and others to help that owner acquire the property, to give that owner resources and education around how to be a responsible property owner, how to do the right repairs, how to fix it up. They've walked with them through that, and I know that there's been a couple of success stories, one of which is that heir got that property, fixed it up into a beautiful property, and has done some great work in getting it rented out and continuing to keep that ownership of that, bring that ownership back into the family's ownership. So interesting program, lots of caveats there, lots of details that are really important to understand with that. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'll tell you to go take a closer look at some of the webinars that Allison Goldie has presented on previously with Community Progress, and we can share those as far as resources down the road. And then there's so much more that local governments and others can do to connect to those existing heir resources, networks, and expertise. And a couple of these things I'm going to mention, quickly. It's not going to be perfect because there's a lot more out there where folks are doing good work. I'll mention first LISC Jacksonville. And their work on heirs property has been really transformative, and in fact has led to LISC National really expanding on that work. And they have created sort of a program or an initiative where now they're in a couple of different cities, or a few different cities, I believe, by combining data analytics, right, partnering with local data partners to understand the scale of the problem, really working with and identifying existing entities with trusted local contacts and organizations that are located in the neighborhoods where they want to reach, and training these folks to be community navigators to better understand and communicate to families at risk about the risks of heir ownership challenges, and coordinating with legal aid and providing resources to some of these families that need it, looking at how to connect with folks using behavioral insights and outreach, right? So that's something that LISC is working on, and particularly going back to LISC Jacksonville, where they kind of started building this network of heir property folks who could learn more about heir property and help to educate the community and then connect them to other resources. And again, I'm underselling all of the work they did, but I think on LISC's website, you can find some information talking about how they invested about $4.2 million. And some of the initial data that they've said that investment has preserved over $40 million in wealth for family members in their community going forward. Right. So I think it's really, I think there's work going on there in Cincinnati, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, and certainly some of their work. I really like pointing out the heir property toolkit that LISC Jacksonville put out there. I think it's an excellent resource that provides just a whole list. You can see on the top of that, if you can read it, there's tools for speakers, heirs property handouts, heir properties resources. It just provides a lot of tools for folks to learn more about and then help to speak to their communities and families about these issues, handouts to give folks more information about the challenges and where and how to seek legal support, and information on available resources that folks can do to seek free legal help. Now, I said free legal help, but I also want to mention, and while that's important because a lot of these families are really, struggling for doing that, it's also, some of these issues are so complex. Right? These are, you say heir property and you say, let's resolve the title, but what does that really mean? And who's equipped to actually help walk a family through that? And I think, free resources are great and really important, particularly in those areas, but a lot of lawyers have been doing this work for decades, right? And are real experts in this area and understand this thing and can really help to work with a family and build trust over time to really start to understand sort of what are the underlying fractures within that family that led to this property being in this state, right? And sometimes, you can't do that in an hour-and-a-half meeting with a legal aid attorney to figure out, a will to put on file. That might be a good result. It might be better than not, but it's also complex. And again, this is a network of, there's a network out there called the Heirs Property Practitioner Network. It includes all kinds of lawyers from all backgrounds, but, that all work on these issues. And they're building this ecosystem of legal service providers. I think they're really great. If you can find somebody within this Heirs Property Practitioner Network to connect with, they are doing a wonderful job of trying to say, hey, I've got this issue in North Carolina, or I've got this issue in Massachusetts. Does anybody know anybody doing this work? Because there are people out there, and historically, we don't always do a great job of finding them or making sure that those names are available as a resource. And so I think looking to build on what HPPN is starting to do is something great, or recognizing them at least as a resource for going forward and how we can connect to them or refer people in that direction. So that's the presentation. We got a lot of extra time to ask questions, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing at this point. Just so I can go ahead and kind of take a look at some of the Q&A. But if you could all give me just a minute or two to sift through some of the questions that hopefully are in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to address as many as possible. Well, that first one, is there a list of resource organizations somewhere? What an excellent question. And I think it depends on the community where you're from, right? It might be if you go to somewhere like Jacksonville, there might be a list of some resources. But I think that that's something that's missing in a lot of communities in a lot of places, right? What resources are there for heirs to sort of learn from? what resources or what grant programs or other things might they qualify for? Who are the lawyers? Who are the private practice attorneys? Who are the legal aid attorneys who can help with that? And in some cases, right, some folks live in an area where there's just not a lot of access to a lot of resources. And trying to figure out and provide them a list of places that might be in neighboring areas or towns that might be helpful, or looking at it more regionally might be something that's a better answer. And so those are really some of the first couple. There's a great question here on, do any solutions work when an occupying heir doesn't trust the authorities enough? I'm going to break the questions into two parts, and I think that's a really excellent question, and that's a really tough one, right? There's a history in a lot of these communities of a lack of trust, and well-deserved in many cases, where the government isn't the best partner. And so I think that's what makes an approach like Liz Jacksonville's approach so important, which is they spent the time and the resources to go out and find individuals or nonprofits or other entities that are already trusted and embedded in the community, and giving them the resources to help train them and understand, like, hey, these are the risks, right? If, you know, these are the risks of having this property in this heir property state. And so I think that I don't think that the local government is always going to be the best resource to be able to teach people about the challenges of it or to figure that out. But at the end of the day, there's a whole system of property ownership that, again, somebody might have a lot of trust issues with. It's not an easy answer to it, but I think starting with finding organizations that believe that this is an issue, that believe they can help and are already established in that community and do have the trust of folks who live there is a really great thing to do. And local governments shouldn't necessarily try to step in and supplant that. They should point to that and say, you can learn more from them, but they should be aware of that and be able to help direct people in that direction. There's a second question within that one that I think was really interesting, which is, what if the owner doesn't believe the property is worth the effort to try to clear title or to try to resolve those title issues? In that, there's a lot of good questions wrapped up in this. And yeah, property value is going to play a role here, right? If that property is saddled with a whole lot of public debt, or there just isn't a whole lot of value in there, you have to ask some questions. First of all, like, what is the value to that family for the land? And then what is going to be the cost of trying to resolve it? And then are there sliding scale questions about how to do so responsibly? Again, those are the kinds of questions where, when you're talking about whether or not there's value enough, sort of trying to find somebody who has some legal expertise and some knowledge of how these systems work within that community is really, really important. Lots of questions here on resources in each of our respective states and cities to resolve titles. I have a question here about, can you speak to the Tyler versus Hennepin County case? Really interesting question there. For those of you that aren't aware, Tyler versus Hennepin County was a case decided by the United States Supreme Court in 2023. And in that case, coming out of Hennepin County in Minnesota, so that's where Minneapolis is, there was, the Supreme Court unanimously determined that a taking under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution occurred, or likely occurred, when the local government foreclosed on a property for unpaid taxes, and then later sold that property for more than the taxes were owed, and didn't return any of those proceeds to the former owner. And so the local government found that the county's retention of that surplus, those surplus proceeds, was a taking under the Fifth Amendment. Right? And so a lot of states did have processes in place. You know, the concept being, you didn't pay your taxes for years and years, we gave you lots of notice, and you know, you've lost the property. Fifth Amendment and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. If you're going to sell it, you've got to return that money to somebody else. Now, a lot of states have changed their laws for that reason. There are questions, though, about how can you access that surplus. all states. There are 50 states with 50 different tax foreclosure systems, and then within many of those states, there are different counties that have different tax foreclosure systems, right? And so the way that those proceeds can be claimed are a little bit different. Whether and to what extent the heir of a family owner who is deceased and the property owner went through that can access those funds is an interesting question that I think is going to have to be one that you'll have to take a look at in different states. Certainly if it's been, probate, there's an estate opened, making a claim through that, potentially. Again, I don't practice in this area, but I think that you're going to have to ask sort of where did this happen? And to what extent can the heirs then claim those proceeds if there are excess proceeds to be claimed? So I think that's a really important, really good question that I've been hearing a lot about lately. So, have you seen many examples of the use of eminent domain to clear title? And the question is that the questioner here says in Missouri, there have been a few places where carefully crafted eminent domain policies have been used at the request of the current owner to clear title and receive some compensation on a property that they otherwise would not have been able to sell. Interestingly, Sarah, that is one of the tools that the city of Savannah has been looking at using. And they have a special statute that applies to properties that are deteriorating or blighted, as the statute says, right, in those cases. And they have been exploring this a little bit more narrowly. I think that is a very interesting question. Obviously, with the phrase eminent domain and the tool, there has been a real serious history of abuse and misuse and things like that. And so there's a whole lot of historical and justified trepidation in sort of continuing to explore those tools. But I can point to a number of places that are talking about that as a potentially a fair way of working with property owners to try to figure out and resolve some of these more complex issues. And so again, it kind of depends on the statute. It depends on the parameters. What are the guardrails to ensure that that tool can't be abused or isn't being abused, right? Whether intentionally or not. And so there's a whole lot of questions about whether or not the right guardrails are in place. But yes, you are. I have seen examples of other places, and Savannah is one place that has really done, I think, a lot of work to try to make sure that all those guardrails are up in order to try to make sure that they're trying to do right by those owners and by the neighborhood as well. There are some interesting questions in here that are probably more and better tailored to ask of heir property practitioners. And by that, I mean lawyers who have been working in this space and helping to represent families, right? So some questions around helping to advise clients with family members who won't work with them on properties with fractured title, other types of tools. I think that those are great questions, but I would definitely recommend reaching out to some of the lawyers who practice in this area in legal aid issue, or some of the lawyers in the Heirs Property Practitioner Network would be better equipped to answer that question in a way that would be thought. Another question on the resources, which I think is a great question, right? Who should keep, update, or curate the resources you just mentioned? I think that's an excellent question, one I don't have the best answer to. I get a lot of grief all the time as a lawyer because I will use words like "it depends" and "generally," and I'm sure you all have lawyers in your lives that do that too. And so on their behalf and my own, I apologize. But the answer to your question is it depends. So I think that the who should keep and curate those resources is really important, in that you have to ask the question locally, who is the right resource that folks are going to feel comfortable going to and trusting, right? That can curate that stuff. I do think local governments should have that information available and curated and be able to serve a role as a connector in certain places. But that might not be the appropriate role for them everywhere, right? And so is there a nonprofit, right? The Heir Property Toolkit is maintained by LISC Jacksonville right now. But maybe maybe there's a legal aid organization that's the good sort of person to take that over, right? It really just depends on who's going to responsibly maintain that, who's going to continue to build those relationships, who can get the word out, and also, whether or not that is a trusted entity that people know they can go to and find information on it and trust that if they follow that information, they might have some chance of success. Community land trusts were raised. I think community land trusts, for those not familiar, are an excellent sort of an ownership tool, sort of a community ownership, whereby the most traditional form of a community land trust is where the land trust, a nonprofit, a 501c nonprofit, sort of owns and holds the land, while a owner comes in and purchases the structure of the house that sits on top of the land. And that's a way of sort of keeping the price down for the owner, keeping it more affordable. And that land is typically owned by the land trust. They lease that land then to the owner, but it's held by the land trust in, long-term. That lease is a long-term lease, a 99-year lease. It looks different everywhere, right? Sure. Certainly, I think a land bank or a local government folks, or the ability for an heir to sort of put that property into a land trust may be a really attractive option in order to try to keep that property affordable, more affordable, and maybe access some other resources that they haven't been able to historically. But again, that kind of depends on whether or not your area has the ability to do that. So I think that I'm going to just look through here and try to pick out maybe two more good questions. Some of these are more statements, and there's some really great ones in here. Another observation here that the legal process to clear or resolve title is often very cumbersome. Yep, and expensive. There's also points about tax sales not giving proper notice for things, so that, all of those kinds of things. I agree with that. And we work a lot in property tax sale issues related to Tyler versus Hennepin County. I urge you to read some of our reform policy briefs on that issue. But I think that certainly tax sales, when they don't give proper notice, make it a lot harder to clear, to do a quiet title action afterwards. But, Anne, that's a great point. And I think tax system should be improved so that the quality of title coming out the back end, but that's a complicated one. I think that, there's a really good question here. Could you explain who has a legal right to make decisions concerning an heir property? For example, do grandchildren have the same authority to make or vote on decisions concerning property as their aunts or uncles if the parent has passed away? Again, a lot of these questions are really appropriate more for the attorneys that represent those practices in the state, right? But I think it all depends on how property passes intestate when somebody passes away within that particular state. But in many cases, what happens when a parent passes on that has an interest and they have two kids is they pass whatever interest they have without a will or estate plan into an undivided 1/2 of whatever that interest was, right? So it just keeps fracturing and breaking down so that all these people have, different interests. And so the power of who has a decision making, the answer is, well, all of them have some interest in the property, and all of them have may have the ability to influence the decision making. So I think that I'll take one more question here. Let's see here. The main idea is to sort of, one of the questions here was, is the main idea to resolve the family ownership or to bring the property back to productive use for the community? The question says, I'm curious, since even with resolved ownership, what ongoing support to maintain the property and avoiding slipping back to being a distressed property again? This is an excellent question. And Monica, thank you for raising that one from the chat. So I think that this is a great question to sort of end it on. And this is the tension and the struggle, right, with this particular issue. From our standpoint, from the Center for Community Progress, right, we work so much in this vacant and abandoned property state because those properties are causing harm to the property, to the neighbors next door. And when property owners, and including heirs, have abandoned the property, right, and there's nothing else to be done, I think there needs to be some sort of public resource or tool to be able to hopefully push that property through maybe to new ownership and more responsible ownership, right? But at what point, up until the property reaches that point, can we do more to sort of help that family resolve their ownership issues? And I think this is a tension between what local governments and land banks want to see and maybe what those who are representing the interest of heirs property owners and others want to see as well. And there's not a clear or a bright line to help figure that out. But I do think that from the local government and land bank perspective, it's that point at which that property becomes vacant and starts to impose harm or cause harm or negative externalities onto the property next door, or something needs to be done. And it may be that the best path is to push that through. Now, hopefully, a lot of these other things to help families resolve these issues are being done earlier in the process to prevent the property from going down that path. And I think that's sort of the main purpose of where we're trying to figure it out. Again, that line can get messy, right? It's not always 100% clear, but it's important that we understand that at some point in time, it does kind of pass over to that. And so I think there's a whole lot of questions that need to be resolved there, but I do think that that's the best I can give you to that particular answer. That is about where I can go. Unfortunately, we had about 35 different questions there. I'd love to get to all of them. We'll take a look, and if there are some other outstanding questions that we didn't get to today, I'd be happy to try to reach out and see if there's more that can be done to answer that. Thank you all for all the work you do. I've seen so many names I recognize, so many I don't. If there's ever anywhere we can be more helpful or connect you to other folks, I'd be happy to do so. And again, thanks so much for spending your time.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything Matt just said, and also thank you, Matt, for a wonderful presentation and so much insightful information about this important topic. We have a survey. If everyone would be willing to fill out, it should take you less than 1 minute to just give us some information about your experience on the webinar to help us improve webinars in the future. This is our last webinar of the year. It feels crazy to say this early in November, but we hope we'll see all of you in 2026 for future webinars. Thanks so much for attending. Bye.